has worked extensively in the mining industry as an environmental and sustainability professional. She started out her working life as a geologist in the gold mining sector, after which she moved into the environmental field. She has worked at various mine sites and corporate functions in a range of commodities, including gold, base metals, heavy mineral sands, and coal. Her experience includes on-mine site management of environmental and sustainability issues, including design, implementation, and management of ISO 14001 compliant environmental management systems. Teresa has also worked in corporate advisory and reporting roles, and she has significant experiences maintaining sustainability issues on large capital projects, including the completion of feasibility studies, risk assessments and management, and also permitting processes. Teresa has worked for large multinational mining companies before opening her boutique environmental and sustainability consultancy, Uvuna Sustainability. Teresa is also chair of the SAMESG Committee, and as such is well poised to talk to us on the subject of ESG as a modifying factor in determining mineral resources and mineral reserves. Teresa, we look forward to hearing from you.
Super, thank you, Tania. Good afternoon, everyone. I was going through the list of people who had signed up for this talk earlier on, and I see a number of familiar names, people that I haven't seen in a long time. So hi to all of you. It would be lovely to catch up, but we'll focus on the talk for the moment. My presentation is really aimed at geologists who are competent persons preparing competent persons reports. I know there are a number of environmental and or social people on the call as well. And the talk is also of relevance to you because you may be called upon to act as a technical specialist when geologists in your company or your consultancy prepare competent persons reports. If my computer wanted to work, sorry, there we go. So for the geos on the call, this graph should look very familiar to you. This is how we classify mineralization in ore bodies, either as a mineral resource or a mineral reserve. Along the horizontal axis, we're talking about our increased understanding of the ore body. And that then moves us through inferred to indicated and measured mineral resources. And along the horizontal axis, sorry, that was the vertical axis. Along the horizontal axis, we're looking at converting mineral resources to mineral reserves. And when that conversion happens, we are looking at a range of modifying factors, and depending on our level of confidence of the impact of those modifying factors on our mineral resource, that will determine what our classification of our mineral reserve ends up being. Now, the modifying factors that comes out of the SAMREC code has a broad definition, but it is very clear that environmental, social, and governance factors are particular modifying factors that need to be looked at when preparing competent persons reports. And the SAMESG guideline, you see the long-winded name there, but SAMESG was written to provide guidance on what information is needed to inform an adequate understanding of these ESG modifying factors, and therefore how to determine and classify mineral resources and mineral reserves. I'll just say that if you've got questions, we'll take questions at the end, so please make a note of them and we can discuss them afterwards. So when we're looking at mineral resources, mineral resources and mineral reserves, we need to demonstrate that the mineralization in the ground has got a realistic prospect of eventual economic extraction. And the competent person has a reasonable amount of latitude to determine what eventual actually means, but it needs to be demonstrated that the RPEEE has appropriately considered the viability of the mineral resource when looking at the modifying factors, which in the opinion of the competent person could influence RPEEE. The determination of RPEE must also be based on the principles of reasonableness, and that it must be justifiable and defendable. And again, this is all the responsibility of the CP to demonstrate this. When we're converting mineral resources to mineral reserves and we start applying the modifying factors, if you are looking within the various categories of mineral resources, those modifying factors need to support a preliminary or detailed mine plan, as well as the economic viability assessments. Now, ESG modifying factors could potentially make a mine economically unfeasible. And that's why we need to have a good understanding of what these modifying factors are from exploration phase already. Our level of confidence in our modifying factors will also determine if the mineral resource can be converted to proved or probable mineral reserves. And where we do not have confidence in the modifying factors, then it would not be appropriate to convert mineral resources to mineral reserves at all. And SAMREC provides for this, that if you do have a lack of confidence or a high degree of uncertainty in your ESG modifying factors, then you're perfectly allowed to not convert resources to reserves at all. I just wanted to take you through some very high-level hypothetical examples, and for a greenfields case as well as for an existing mine. And I'll pose some questions afterwards, which I'd like the CPs to think about. And happy to exchange emails on the topic with you afterwards. The Zoom facility is not necessarily the best to having a long debate that we would have if we were in person, but happy during the question time to just discuss this in more detail. So the first, all of this is a hypothetical example, and we're going to be looking at some of the ESG modifying factors that could impact on your declarations of reserves and resources. So this is our landscape. This is the area where we think there's a high chance of us finding some form of mineralization, some deposit that we think would be of interest to our company. We see that there's a community sitting here in the middle. There's a whole lot of rivers that are running through the area. The mine planning guys are thinking, fantastic, we've got some water that we can use in the processing plant. There's also along the sort of river in the center of the screen and up on the eastern side, there's a boundary into the Endangered Species National Park that obviously provides protection for a range of species for which there are conservation priorities. And so some of the questions which CPs should be thinking of, if this is your particular context, is firstly, should you try and explore within the Endangered Species National Park? And factors that should be considered here are things like the legal requirements of the country within which the project takes place, because many countries have legislation preventing any kind of exploration activities in national parks. And assuming that you are actually allowed to undertake some field work, the question then is, what would you include in terms of these sensitive receptors? How would you declare them in your mineral resource? For the community area, what would you do with the nature reserve? How would you treat the mineralization underneath and adjacent to the rivers? Equally, how would you classify the mineral reserves in the sensitive receptor areas based on these ESG modifying factors? If we look at a random example of an existing operating mine, we're preparing our CP reports on a regular basis, and as things happen within the mine, that can influence the reserves or resources and reserves for that particular operation. So for this random example, there's potentially a polluted river. We've got on the eastern side some rehabilitation backlog, and sort of to the west of that, we've got an area that's prone to sinkholes. So these are all liabilities that are attached to the mine. So in our annual CP report, given that our determination of the cutoff grade should consider the existing mining costs, how would you reassess the cutoff grade for this particular mine, considering these liabilities, the polluted river, the rehab backlog, and the sinkholes? And it's important to recognize and realize that those liabilities need to be addressed in terms of the legal authorizations which this mine holds. And in fact, addressing those liabilities will determine ultimately whether or not that mine receives a closure certificate. So how does SAMESG work in terms of assisting competent persons to determine their mineral resources and mineral reserves? Well, the guideline basically talks to all the ESG modifying factors which could influence RPEE. It's aligned with the principles of the 2016 SAMREC and SAMVAL codes, and it was launched with those codes, and it provides a supplementary guidance to CPs to understand what environmental and social aspects should be reported on and the level of detail at which these should be reported on. There's 9 components within the SAMESG guideline, and it focuses on material, environmental, and social modifying factors. So if you think of an existing operation, it's not saying we're worried about every little 5-litre oil spill that could present a small liability for the company. We're talking about the big things that, should you be going through a due diligence process, for example, the big material issues that are likely to come up and influence that transaction. The way that SAMESG is structured, we've got the 9 key components that are effectively the same for exploration or reporting on exploration, mineral resources, and mineral reserves, but we expect an increasing amount of detail across these components as you move from one classification to another. So in the exploration phase, we're wanting CPs to describe, for example, that your context is that you are in an area where there's a national park, you're aware that there's a community which potentially have to be resettled in order for the mine to be developed. When we're getting to mineral reserve status, during that stage, you've either completed or are busy finalizing a feasibility study. At that point in time, you will know whether or not the community is potentially going to move, what the costs are associated with it, potentially what the long-term operating costs are going to be as a result of that community resettlement. So, as I say, these are the 9 requirements of SAMESG, and we expect the level of detail to increase and be supplemented by field work as you move through to mineral reserves, whereas in exploration, a lot of it, at least initially, will be largely desktop-based. What we've done earlier this year, and it'll be published later in the year, is together with Tania as the chair of the SSC, we've taken the SAMESG and we've actually integrated into table 1 of SAMREC. So for example, you'll just see here the red italicized text that shows you what the SAMESG requirement is and how it's being integrated into SAMREC table 1. As I say, that'll be published later on the website, and will serve as a more prominent reminder to CPs that the SAMESG requirements need to be considered, because we've had feedback from a number of CPs that, oh, well, when we look at table 1, we just go through what's in table 1, and if SAMESG doesn't appear in table 1, then we don't really pay attention to it. So we've tried to correct that through including the text directly in table 1. As a competent person, there's obviously a lot of responsibility on your shoulder for the content of your CP reports. You, as a lead CP, will accept overall responsibility for your mineral reserve and mineral resources. And where there are other people who have contributed to that report, you need to first of all make sure that you're getting the right people to contribute. That's often easier said than done, because we know in small companies there's potentially one geo who doesn't necessarily have an environmental specialist as a full-time member of the team. However, you will have to go through some environmental permitting process, and that permitting process will generate information which the CP can then use to apply SAMESG to the report. Where other people have contributed to the report, it's important to make sure that those people sign off so that it is clear that there have been a number of contributors, particularly where you do have these technical specialists who are able to provide input to the report. When estimating a mineral resource, SAMESG says that it might be a team effort, but when you're estimating your mineral reserve, it is a team effort. You do need other technical disciplines to weigh in, particularly when it comes to modifying factors that could impact the financial viability of a potential future operation. SAMESG also asks the CP to undertake a site visit, and I can't stress the importance of that, because a number of these sensitive receptors that I've pointed out in the hypothetical examples would become a lot more obvious if you actually are doing a site visit, even in the earliest exploration phases. We do also have the amazing use of technology such as satellite imagery, Google Earth, which is a pretty good surrogate for a site visit, but actually being on the ground and seeing what's happened and what's happening from the experience outside of just looking at the geology is fundamentally important to getting SAMESG properly integrated into your CP reports. So in summary, ESG modifying factors can really significantly influence the viability of a mine, whether it's a future mine or an existing mine. And investors these days want to know about these ESG modifying factors. The information that is prepared in the glossy corporate sustainability reports, it doesn't cut it. We are busy finalizing a detailed review of a number of CP reports to garner lessons on how SAMESG has or has not been integrated. And the corporate glossy GRI aligned sustainability reports don't provide adequate information that an investor would need to make a well-informed decision. So that's why SAMESG has been developed. And I've got the link here. It's on the SAMCODE's website. There's a link on the front page of the website to the guideline. It is very simple to understand. We're doing a review of it at the moment to correct some typos and perhaps make it a little bit easier to use. But the substance is there and the requirements are clear in terms of the information that needs to be considered when writing the CP reports. And as a committee, I think James Lake is also on this call. James is part of the SAMESG committee. We're available to support and help anyone who has queries with the guideline. So please do feel free to reach out either to any of us directly or through Tania. So I'm happy to take calls at this point. I'll stop sharing my screen so that it would be great if you do have a question, raise your hand, but also then if you could turn your video on just for the time that you're talking, so that we get a sense to see who's actually there. That would be very useful. Thanks. Do we have any questions or comments?
Maybe for me, Craig Smith.
Yes, Craig.
I'll turn my video on. When it comes to exploration geology, I think one of the things we're hearing out of this and from the last few years is that a geologist is no longer just a geologist. You've got to be an environmental scientist, and you've got to have a bit of sociology behind you as well. That's the comment, and the question is, are there guidelines for quantifying some of the values of some of these issues?
Sure.
One man's environmental disaster is another man's environmental success.
Yeah, I hear you, Craig. Look, there's a lot being asked of, particularly the exploration geos who are the first on the ground, and often, coming face to face with communities, landowners, in a context that is evolving at a rapid rate. There's a lot of the hardcore liability impact that can be quantified. For example, you can cost how to undertake rehabilitation, you can cost how to clean up a polluted river, What you have challenges costing is the things that are the reputational impact. Things such as a company making a promise to a community that is made by the project manager, who then delivers his project on time within budget. He goes off to the next, his next role and progresses with his career, and a general manager picks up a mine where there's a whole legacy of commitments. The reputational damage that can be accrued to a company as a result of not managing that, that is particularly difficult to cost. But as a starting point, what SAMESG is asking of competent persons is to quantify the liabilities of associated with not managing these environmental components correctly. And a lot of that you can quantify, and you should be including into your operating and capital costs. If that answers your question, I see Tania's raising her hand. Tania, go for it.
I just wanted to add on to what you were saying, and also to mention that I think a lot of these questions and the details you and your team are going to be answering in our September workshop on ESG. And I'm taking the opportunity to punt that workshop at the moment. So everybody who is attending this, please look out for it, where Teresa and the SAMESG committee will be talking about not only some of these issues, but others, specifically what's been found in the CPRs that they've reviewed, and how to deal with some of those issues. So please look out for that.
Thanks for the punt, Tania. Are there any other questions from anyone else on the call?
Hi, Teresa.
Yes, hi.
Hi, this is Stephen here. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. So I just had a question. Thanks. There was exceptionally useful, and thank you for sharing your insights into this. And yeah, found the presentation extremely useful. So I had a question more specifically on the ESG, and I guess more on the governance aspect. Would you perhaps give us an example of a specific governance risk that would be considered material, that would need to be considered as part of one of the modifying factors? I guess it's quite evident in terms of environmental and social, but it's more that I'm curious to understand what potential governance issues would be considered.
Thanks. Trust somebody to always find the potential weak point within the guideline, and I would agree with you, Stephen, that governance is not necessarily as explicit as environmental and social, but governance failures in particular are things that people are not always going to be open and transparent about, and the governance failures would come in terms of what the company is actually doing to ensure that it is an active steward of the environment and an active steward of social issues. It would also be how the company conducts its business together with its suppliers. Does it pay them on time? Does it undertake transparent processes when it applies for permits? Is there anything underhanded? Those governance risks, you would see the results of a lack of governance manifesting in, for example, a polluted environment or poor relationships with communities, but it doesn't necessarily mean, particularly when it comes to relationships with communities, it doesn't necessarily mean that poor governance has been the only contributing factor to those relationships. So it is certainly less easy to quantify than the cost of, for example, moving a community. But those are some of the examples where governance would impact on a mine's reputation and viability. And some of them, for example, in a financial transaction, if company A is buying company B, there is potentially an opportunity for company A to address some of the legacies that the previous owners have left behind, but that always obviously takes time and money. But the company acquiring a new asset for them, if they're aware of it, at least they know where to invest the energy to improve those issues.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments?
Doesn't look like it. So Tania, we can expect to see SAMESG compliant reports coming through soon. I'm very excited.
They're probably all keeping all their questions for your later presentation.
True. All right. Yeah, as I say, you've got my details. Do we share these presentations, Tania, or what's the protocol after the calls?
We
Are
are
you
recording
happy
the
with that
presentation,
presentation?
and we will get it online in some way or form, shape or form, but we haven't quite got that sorted out yet, but we are recording it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Awesome. Well, then I think our time's up. Very happy to be in touch with anyone who would like to reach out. Thank you for taking the time to dial into the call, and keep safe wherever you happen to be locked down at this point in time.
For me, thank you very much, Teresa. Thank you to our delegates, and thank you, Tania. Tania, any last words from you? I think not. With that, I'm going to close the meeting. So thanks everybody for attending. And we have another one tomorrow. We've got a CPD course tomorrow, and there's another lecture from Moscow, I believe, at 4:30 in the afternoon. So we'll see you all then. Thank you for attending.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao.
Thanks, Teresa. That was good.
Thanks, James. Cheers.
Yes, bye.